I'm a Mac person, and I haven't used a mouse, I think, in 5 years. But I'm actually also a full-time writer, and I put all my stuff together to come up here so carefully yesterday because I was leaving really early this morning, and what's the one thing I forgot? My computer. So I'm doing this on this computer, on Jesse's computer. So another thing that may happen also is that I use Mac software, and when I translate it to PowerPoint, sometimes the words all go wrong. So you may see a line that just runs off the side of the page because it didn't translate properly. And I'll do my best to explain that as it happens. Anyhow, here I am. This is the book of my experiment of a year trying to live a 1.5 degree lifestyle. I won't spend a lot of time talking about climate because you're at a sustainability summit and you probably know it already, that there is this business of climate change that comes from the rapidly warming atmosphere, and it's warming because of all the carbon dioxide that we're adding to the air. And finally, in 2015, everyone hit an agreement. The IPCC made an agreement so that we would all in the world work together to solve this problem. And the way we were going to do this was rapidly dial down the amount of carbon dioxide going into the air. And in 2015, they said we're going to aim for 2 degrees. We're going to hold the temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. And you can see here these curves that, oh, if we start here, we only have to drop 9% a year. If we start then 2% a year. And there was a big budget. If you look down in the bottom left-hand corner, 1170 gigatons of CO2. Then in 2018, they looked more closely and said, you know, 2 degrees is really, really bad. The conditions there, we really have to reconsider this and go for 1.5 degrees. And that's where my title and my story comes from. Now, if you look at those lines and where we are now, it's no longer a curve or a slope. It's now a cliff. To get down to 1.2, the amount of carbon to stop before we hit the carbon ceiling, the maximum amount of carbon we can add, we have to make these ridiculous reductions in carbon. And if you put it in terms of the whole pandemic, when nobody was flying, when nobody was driving, when everybody was home, when you look at 2021, when 2020, when the deepest of the pandemic was happening, it dropped 7.6%, the carbon emissions. And that's what we have to drop every year between now and 2030 to get there. And of course, what happened? We went right back up to even higher than we were before. To the point that a lot of people are saying, you know, well, the world's most ambitious goal is out of reach. Why won't anyone admit it? Well, people are admitting it, but we're still aiming for it, and lots of good things have been happening. If you see the most recent IPCC report that just came out a month ago, they pointed out, you know, that renewable energy, photovoltaics have dropped in price, wind has dropped in price, concentrated solar panel, the amount of solar's going up, batteries have gotten cheaper. As Amy Westerfeld, a really good writer, pointed out that the report made one thing abundantly clear. The technologies and policies necessary to address climate change exist. The only real problems, obstacles, are politics and the fossil fuel companies. Now, years ago, you may have heard, this is all I'm going to be talking about personal responsibility, about the personal changes that we can make. And of course, everybody remembers the whole carbon footprint. What is a carbon footprint? And everybody said, British Petroleum invented the term carbon footprint to blame us, i.e., you know, we'll still buy their gas, but we won't, you know, they really want us to sort of recycle better that. And it's not true. The term was invented by a professor at UBC, now in Toronto, Bill Rees, a few years before, the whole idea of the footprint. Up here you see where I say the line goes off the stage because it's no longer a paragraph. But this was, you know, personal accountability is not only irrelevant, it was designed and implemented by fossil fuel companies. Michael Mann, who's a famous climate scientist, said not only, in his book, he said, a study shows that emphasizing personal actions can actually undermine support for substantive changes that are needed. That study was ridiculous, by the way, I read it. It's convenient for the fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil, Shell, and BP. Well, the other thing you always hear is that it's not us. Just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions. This was published, probably the most famous headline in The Guardian for the longest time, people saying this. I collect tweets where people use this as an excuse. 100% of companies are responsible. My air conditioning has nothing to do with it. 71% of emissions are from the 100 companies. Buying Bitcoin has nothing to do with it. 100 companies are responsible. I can keep eating cows. So, you know, these kinds of things, this became the most popular excuse. Where am I? Oh, yeah, there. In fact, when you look at the study that they were talking about, the study from 2017, you find it isn't 100 companies. It's a bunch of countries. The leading ones are China, Saudi Arabia, Gazprom, Iranian oil. Finally, in number 6, you get an oil company that's in North America, and then you've got Mexico, Russia, and then you get Shell. So really, you know, we're talking about national interests, and it's not going to be easy to change them. The other interesting thing is what they're talking about. When you talk in carbon, there are 3 kinds of emissions. There's the emissions from actually making the stuff, making the oil. There's the scope 2 emissions, which are very small. But the main thing is scope 3 emissions, burning the stuff. And that's us buying it and putting it in our tanks. 90% of emissions from fossil fuels come from burning them, not from them making them. We're buying what they're selling. And that's the fundamental problem. It's us, not them. Sometimes it's hard. You know, a few years ago, everything was gas. Everything's powered by gas. You're sort of locked in. People are locked into their cars because of the way the society has set itself up. But it's us. And as the IPCC said in the report, every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice we make matters. It's all about choices. Now, a few years ago, a study came out of Finland called 1.5 Degree Lifestyles. Oh, I did it accidentally. That taught us how we had to change our lives to keep the temperature rise under 1.5 degrees. It assumed that emissions are caused by consumption, not production. And I learned about it from this woman, a London activist named Ronald Reedhead, who decided, reading this report, that she was going to try and keep her annual carbon emissions below 1 ton per year. And by comparison, average EU citizen is 8 tons, the average US citizen is 16, et cetera, going down that list. Well, and she got that 1 ton, again, by following the curve to stay under 1.5 degrees, warming. These are what are called lifestyle emissions. The Finnish study assumed that, work based on other study work, that 72% of emissions, total emissions, come out of the choices we make, where we decide to live, what we decide to eat. A lot of that is where you're born, and a lot of that you have less control than you'd like, but that's the basic thesis. The other 28% is sort of governments buying F-35s and running passport offices, as they do so well. And, you know, all of these things are, but so she picked that black circle, the 2050 1-ton target. I looked at that and thought, this is impossible. It's basically background noise 1 ton just from living in Canada. So I picked the 2030 target of 2.5 tons. And 2.5 tons, half the world lives under 2.5 tons. Most of them are living in energy poverty. And again, countries like Tanzania and Pakistan. And you know, they don't have enough energy to do much, to cook. They don't have enough energy to have proper lighting. So already half the world is there, and you can see us way up in the upper right-hand side at about, we're in Canada, lifestyle emissions, not the total per capita of everything, but the stuff that they consider lifestyle at about 14 tons. And all of us, it has to be remembered that like 49% of emissions, of the world's emissions, come from just the richest 10% people in the whole wide world, and that's most of us, probably everybody in this room. It doesn't take much to get there. Now, after I started my book, the Finnish group got together with a whole bunch of other people, including this Hot or Cool Institute, which I'm now involved with, to do an update of the study. And they used different countries, and this time they included Canada in the list. They keep away from the United States because it just always dominates the discussion. But when you look at the situation here with Canada, we lead in almost every single category: the most food emissions, the most housing, most transport, the most goods, and the most leisure and services to get to that 14.2 tons. But going back to the first thing, it breaks down into these main categories. The three main ones: nutrition, housing, mobility, which I'll get as complicated, goods, the stuff we buy, and leisure and services. Now, I'm a spreadsheet kind of guy from my architecture days and everything else, and so I figured the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to build a giant spreadsheet where I'm going to put a number to everything, and I'm going to fill it out day by day. You can see this on January 6th. I went out for a big, ridiculous Hungarian dinner, and my total carbon for the day was like 13,390, when my target is 6,800 a day. Now, good thing about a spreadsheet is you can amortize it. So if I don't go out for another Hungarian dinner for 8 years, it spreads itself out over the whole thing, and it works. And it's really hard to find the data. I based a lot of my information on this British book, How Bad Are the Bananas? And I'm using British data for Canada. I then later found Canadian sources, and I was using the 10-year-old version. The new version came out later. So, you know, I'm using a British chicken when I'm in Canada, and a Canadian chicken's going to be different. The other thing that's really, really hard about it is that if you buy an air conditioner today, it's made in China. And so the emissions that come from making it, if it's made in China, you know, are they Chinese emissions or are they my emissions? And under the IPCC, everybody looks at sort of countries' carbon budgets. But again, when you look at it on a consumption basis, they should be on my side of the ledger. And this is something that a lot of people are getting to know about, particularly in construction, the idea of embodied carbon, the amount of carbon that goes into making the stuff that you don't see because it happened before you got it. And I think it's a terrible name, embodied carbon, because it's not embodied, it's in the air already. And I never liked it, and I said, let's rename it to upfront carbon. And the building industry has now actually accepted my term. They evidently read my work. And they now, a bit of the embodied carbon before is now called upfront carbon, because it's a now emission, it's happening right now. That's why so many in the industry are looking at mass timber. You hear about this. This was the Sudbury, the School of Architecture at Laurentian University being built, that I went up to Sudbury to see it under construction. There I am in front of it, the first major mass timber building in Ontario. And it, because it's made of wood, has a very low upfront carbon because trees are sequestering carbon. They store it. But everything else that you make can have a big carbon footprint. Apple, which is great about publishing everything, their environmental stuff, they give you the embodied carbon that is in every product they make. And 83% of my little iPhone 11 is from the production, the upfront carbon of making it. Could you lift 80 kilograms? I can't lift, I can lift my phone, it's really small, but 80 kilograms of carbon go into making it. And people don't understand this concept at all. I mean, this is a street car ad for an electric car, and Hyundai asks, why shouldn't a car have the same emissions of a bike? And some really smart graffiti person went in and said, because of the carbon embedded in making it. You know, Hyundai didn't understand embodied carbon, but this kid did. And, you know, nobody knows this because it's not published. Apple published it, but, like, Who knows the embodied carbon of their pickup truck? They don't. They think, oh, this is more efficient, or I'm going to get an electric one. So this is the little bit of background. Then I sort of got into what I did. So, let's look at the first category, nutrition. And that, they said, was all the food consumed at home and cooking and everything in the home. And I really like Swiss Chalet, for instance. So I decided, well, I'm going to figure out what is the carbon footprint of my Swiss Chalet dinner. And this is going to be the explanation of why this exercise was fun, but really hard. First, I got to order in. Then I go look in the book and figure out what's the carbon footprint of my portion of chicken, which I weigh, and I found out how much a chicken weighs and calculated out using that English number, because I couldn't find a Canadian one, and it's going to be completely different because we carry our chickens further. We heat the chicken barns in a colder winter, so it's not going to be a good number. This was easier. I go online into all the specifications for gas-fired rotisserie, figure out that. Then I go and weigh the plastic that it all came in and figure out the carbon footprint of that. And then I order it for delivery and find out that the whole thing is just completely dominated by the delivery. I mean, it's bigger than anything else, the carbon footprint of it. And it's really hard because there is a Swiss Chalet 3 kilometers from my home. And yet for the delivery, for some reason, they send it 8 kilometers. So these numbers are wild all over the place. They can only be approximations. But there's some things that we really do know down pat. And that is, for instance, that because cows live a long time and they're ruminants, they basically emit a great deal of methane in their eating, and they eat a lot of feed towards the end of their life. The carbon footprint of beef is really high. It's like 36 grams per 36 kilograms. No, I'm reading this wrong. Anyhow, it's a lot. You can see going down that tomatoes, why are tomatoes higher than fish and cheese? That's bizarre. I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat the meat, but I eat tomatoes. But tomatoes, except for that short window where we get field tomatoes, are all grown in gas-fired greenhouses or they're imported. And that gives them actually a really high carbon footprint, which is why you have to think about seasonability. It becomes, what's interesting, I'll go into a little more, because some of these are just weird. That you see that cheese, because it's dairy, is much higher than pig, than eating pork. So, you don't really need to be a vegetarian diet isn't any better at all. Even a vegan diet, if you happen to love tomatoes and imported vegetables, is going to be a problem. This English study said that shipping wasn't much of a problem. They broke it down, and they say that the transport is just that blue thing at the top. But this is, again, data from the UK. And they missed, I went into all of their studies, and they missed a big thing in transportation. They just counted the diesel fuel for running the truck. They didn't count the refrigeration, which has refrigerant gases leak, and they have a huge carbon footprint. And I did other research, and my students did research, and they found that 3% of global emissions come from the leaking from these refrigerants. So, sure, it's okay to eat meat like this old ad, but in that whole year, I never had a steak. I did have that one schnitzel that ruined my January. But, avoiding meat was the big thing. But, this isn't hard because chicken's nice, pork is nice, and they're much lower, and to have them occasionally isn't bad at all. The other biggest problem is waste. Like 40% of all the food we grow and bring into our house, so much of it is wasted, and that's obviously just carbon going into the sky for absolutely nothing as it goes into the garbage, as it goes to landfill, and then generates even more methane in landfill. Portion sizes have grown incredibly in the last 30 years. We're eating so much more that a lot of carbon is wasted just because we're eating more than we need to. So portion size, because I was weighing everything, became actually a really important thing. My wife, who used to write about food and always would say your piece of meat shouldn't be any bigger than a deck of cards, was suddenly serving me these teensy portions, but you got used to them and it's enough. But this is how portions had changed. The other thing that we did, when my wife was writing about food almost a decade ago, we basically tried to eat what was a 19th century Ontario diet because, we wanted to minimize the importing of food. And so we had a lot of turnip, we had a lot of potatoes, a lot of parsnip, more turnip, and a lot of meat because it was easy to keep cows alive all winter and take them when you needed to. And this was basically, people here were English and Scots, and they had a pretty boring diet. I had it much better because my wife is a great cook, and we could eat Indian food, which had a lot, and we could eat Chinese food with a lot of tofu. There are a lot more options if you want to cut down your meat today than there were in the 19th century. The other thing that my wife does is a great deal of canning. When the tomatoes grow, she buys them by the bushels and sets them up for the year. So even though she's not doing that 19th century diet project anymore, thank God, we at least still try to eat everything local as much as possible. So when it comes to food, this is what we should be thinking about doing. If you like, go vegan, but otherwise, try, and if it's like me, going vegan is too hard, then, the red meat and the lamb and shrimp because it's imported from the other side of the world. It's what I call a climatarian diet rather than a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet. You're eating what's best for the climate. And shorten the food chain, and I know here that's impossible in North Bay. I mean, everything is coming on a transport truck from down south, and the carbon footprint of your food, almost whatever you eat, is going to be so much higher. The food terminal is right near where I live, and everything's coming from there all the way up here, and that's going to be a problem, but every bit helps. Manage portion sizes, and if you do takeout or delivery, see if they can do it by bike or pick it up yourself. Now, how we live. This is another thing that's very different from where I live from up here, and I've tried to modify this and take all this into consideration. If you've been to Toronto, there's the big hill, the escarpment, where Lake Ontario came up to until the Ice Age, and I live at the top of the escarpment, which wasn't developed. It was basically farms and rich people, like these fox hunters living there. This is Bathurst Street, just north of St. Clair, if you know Toronto at all, in about 1890. And the whole area was separated by this ravine, like I live at the top of that hill there. And here they are having bicycle races up the hill. In 1913, they took all the garbage in the city and all the crap dust out of the coal furnaces and filled that ravine with made this toxic roadway here. And this is how it looked after it was finished, and they put streetcars in. This is how it looks today with the Loblaws. They can't build any high buildings there because the ground is, believe me, totally toxic still. And they had a St. Clair streetcar. It was designed under what's called a streetcar suburb, which were very popular in Boston and various cities in the States, where you put in streetcars and you lay out the roads so that everybody lives in a relatively narrow lot and can walk up to the main street and do their shopping. So this is what it looked like before it was all filled up. In 1884, it was farmland, and 25 years later, it was completely built out. And it looked like this, with everything filled, all because of that streetcar. Streetcar came in 1913. My house, the one in the middle, was built in 1918. As you can see, it's a developer special. The three houses in the row are all identical, and that's the way it worked. And they didn't take out the streetcars. Originally, it was a separate allowance. Then they took out the allowance and let cars drive in. And then 15 years ago, they put it back, and this is how it is today. And it is very much what they're talking about in Europe and talking about everywhere, a 15-minute city, where I can get almost everything that I need within a 15-minute walk from my house. And they've opened up shared office spaces. Toronto Western Hospital opened up a family clinic, literally 5 minutes a walk from me, and that's where I have my doctor now. And, it was a busy street, St. Clair Avenue. I saw my very first movie at the Vaughan Cinema, because I've always lived in the area. And it didn't look that much different. in the 50s than your Main Street does, which this is a picture of, I guess, in the early 50s as well, which was a vibrant shopping street where people lived nearby in the neighborhood and they could walk to the main street and they could do all their shopping. And it was vibrant when this was done in the 60s, and the Woolworths and the Kreskes were there. And again, I looked at these historical maps of North Bay, and I could see that all the historic houses where everybody lived were all, as they say, within walking distance of the downtown area. And what happened here is the same thing that happened in almost every town and city, which is the malls open. And when the malls opened and people started getting cars and driving to the malls and then opened more malls, basically it sucked the life out of the main streets. And the other thing that's happening in every city, of course, is the hospitals pack up and they move out of town too. And I was sitting there, I saw today that you actually can bicycle to the hospital, but I thought, my God, does everybody, when they get old, how do they get to see a doctor if the doctor's at the hospital? If all the hospitals, like they are here, like they are in Barrie, like they're building in Ottawa, like they're building in Windsor, everybody, all the provincial planners say the hospital has to be where there can be acres of parking because everybody drives to the hospital. Well, I bicycle to the hospital in the city, but that's another story. And what the thing is, there's a very smart thinker of my favorite tweet of the last decade who, as a transportation planner, basically said land use and transportation are the same thing in different languages. I mean, the fact is that our cities and our towns look the way they do because of the car. You can't separate the car from the urban design. My house works because it's a pattern based on the streetcar, and they kept the streetcar. How you get around determines what you build, and they're two sides of the same coin. Now, 30 years ago, before I knew about all this stuff, I bought a little cabin on a little lake just south of Dorset, a little lake called Shoe Lake. And I was an architect at the time and went into the local real estate office. It was a hot market, and it had a photocopier, and everybody was laughing at this place because it had a geodesic dome. And, you know, a little white bubble sitting by the lake. And they were laughing at it because it's a small lake. Everybody in Muskoka wants a big lake. And they laughed at it because it was water access. Nobody wanted this. I bought the whole thing for less than the price of a parking space in a condo in Toronto today. And, you know, I go up there in June now, and I try and work until September at the cottage. Sometimes it's hard. And it's water access again, so everything has to come by boat. But I learned how hard it is up here to live a low-carbon lifestyle. That I went to the farmer's market in Huntsville once. It's 38 kilometers. Take that up by 2, and that essentially was almost 3 days worth of carbon. And I drive a little Subaru parked next to this thing that's so ridiculous. And even with that, just driving to Huntsville was enough to blow my carbon budget for the week. And that's because our whole urban pattern, it's the car that made all this possible. In the States, they basically built a whole highway for defense. And the whole idea was, well, if all the people in all the companies are in cities and the Russians bomb us, then we're going to lose all the people in all the cities. So let's spread everybody out. So they actually built this system, and they got IBM and all the companies to move out of the city into sort of suburban office plants. And that's how we got the suburbs. But it was a pattern of life that everybody loved. If you had the money, if you were white in the States, you could get a mortgage and you could get your little dream house. And the dream hasn't changed. As Elon Musk calls it, it's the future we want. The only difference is that Elon Musk wants it to be electric, with solar shingles on the roof, with electric cars and batteries in the garage. The problem is, of course, that doesn't scale. It's very expensive. Even the cheapest Tesla is expensive. That solar roof costs $50,000. That battery costs $10,000. And of course, it's on a big lot. So this isn't going to happen. It works well in California on suburban lots. But we know what to do. I mean, Canada's made some great contributions. We know how to build out of low upfront carbon materials like wood. The most significant Canadian invention is this house, built in 1974 in Regina, Saskatchewan. A team of scientists and engineers were asked to build a solar-powered house because solar power is all the rage at the time. Everybody was thinking solar, solar, solar. But they said, we're in Regina. There's no sun half the year. It's really low. We're up north. This is a dumb idea. We're going to build a super insulated house. We're going to wrap it in a foot of insulation, and we're going to seal it really tightly. And then, because it's sealed so tightly and people need fresh air, we're going to sort of invent what they called a heat exchanger, an air-to-air heat exchanger, where they would bring in outside air and warm it up and bring in fresh air through it. And we'll face south to get a little sun. And they built the whole house for $60,000. And the province came back to them and said, no, we said we wanted a solar house. This isn't a solar house. I said, but a solar house is stupid. We want it solar. So the province insisted that they spend $60,000 to put this solar system to get hot water for it. But the house was so efficient, it hardly needed any heat or any hot water. They say that this was the equivalent of about $30 worth of oil consumption. Went $60,000 for the fancy system, and it broke within 2 years. So the point is, we have this fascination, Elon Musk, with the fancy technologies, but this Canadian invention, the super insulated house, does the job. And this guy, a physicist in Germany, saw it with another one that was similar in the States, and came up with the concept of what's called the passive house. And the whole principle of the passive house is exactly what we saw in Saskatchewan. Lots of insulation, a fresh air heat exchanger, good control of sunlight. And they recognize their roots. Here they are giving Harold Orr, the builder of that house, a big award recognizing the heritage that came out of Canada. And this is what a wall looks like when it's built out of this. You can see that cellulose insulation inside a very thick wall with triple glazing. And the houses are usually relatively simple in form because every corner is a problem. Here's one that was built in England that was actually built out of straw bale, and that straw bale and clay inside. He had a little wood stove for the coldest days that he never used. Even when they had the storm, this famous storm called the Beast from the East, they never put on that fire because the house is like a thermos bottle. And it went through all these storms like that, and the sunlight was very nice, even on the coldest days. And I have another friend who built one high in Colorado, no heat, tiny wood stove. And I went to see, is anyone doing this in North Bay? And I saw that there was an article from February that a local developer wants to do a condo project in Passive House, and I saw this other company is building one near North Bay. It makes a tremendous amount of sense in this kind of climate that even up here, you can barely need any energy to heat the house. But what we've got is we've got 76% of the province heated by natural gas. Do you have natural gas in North Bay? Yeah? And what does Doug Ford want to do? He wants to expand natural gas. When you look at the budget that he's proposed to expand natural gas, it comes out to $26,000 per house. If you took that $26,000 and put it into insulation and windows, you wouldn't need to heat the thing. But this is his mentality. I'm not going to be critical of him. I know you're a conservative riding here. The other key change that's been developed are heat pumps, which used to be really, really expensive and didn't work in cold weather. And so you'd have to have supplementary electric heating for the coldest days. But now they've got them working down to minus 20 Celsius. So even in North Bay, you could probably use a heat pump and get through almost the entire winter. So once again, what do we do? What I think we do, if we want to really lower our carbon footprint, is we use natural materials with low embodied carbon combined with super insulation, high quality windows to passive house standards. In existing buildings, reduce demand as much as possible and then make up the difference with a heat pump. In terms of your carbon footprint, apartments are obviously going to be better than houses, semi-detached better, because they've just got less wall to the outside. And then I just look at that downtown, and you've got to rebuild our main streets and rebuild our communities so that you don't have to go to the mall, so that you can go back to a store there and walk and electrify everything. Now, how we move, as you know from the previous slide, they made it as a separate category, but really they're two sides of the same coin. And we know that efficiency improvements haven't made that much difference in the amount that our cars use, because what we all did was they got more efficient. We bought bigger cars, SUVs and pickup trucks and that. And they've gotten gargantuan. You know, when I park at the LCBO in Dorset and just look at these things, I can barely get in the spots usually because all of the rest of them are there. And, you know, I used to be sanctimonious and say, oh, well, my recreation is human powered. I get in my little rowing shell and I don't, have a big boat and all of those things. But it still takes me 5 days of carbon to get there. So I may do this all summer long, but I can't say that I'm solving the problem. You know, recreational boating is a few minutes out of a year. It's getting there that's killing me. And the dream hasn't changed. You know, nothing has changed in 50 years. You look at this picture, I guess, from the 60s, and it's the guy and his family and towing the boat. And you look at this picture from the recent Ford ad, and it's exactly the same thing. The only difference is the house is bigger, the truck is bigger, and the boat is bigger. But this is what we have to go and fix. And again, we can't be doing this. Now we have this electric dream. I complain about electric cars, that they still clog the sidewalks, they still clog the highways, they're no different than anything else. And the other thing that everybody forgets is the embodied carbon of making it. If you look at this graph and compare a Prius over the electric cars, depending on where they are, because a lot depends on the amount of how the electricity is made. But if you look at Norway, which is similar to Ontario, almost entirely clean electricity until Doug Ford ruins it, it's about half of a Prius, but it's still high. You still have a problem with it. A Tesla Model 3 is about half of what a regular car is, and that's because of the upfront emissions of about 14 tons. And the pickup truck could be 40 tons, the electric pickup trucks that they're proposing, that Ford is already selling. I did a calculation comparing it to Toyota, a small Toyota Yaris, gasoline-powered, and found that, in fact, the electric pickup truck over its lifetime still had a carbon footprint that was higher than the Toyota Yaris because of the upfront carbon of making the thing. And I wrote about this in our website, and the CEO of the company that I work for, which is now the biggest English language media company in the world, said, what are you guys doing? You're supposed to promote electric cars. We like electric cars. Why are you saying it's worse than a small gas car? And I said, well, it is. He said, well, don't do that anymore. So, nobody wants to hear this, including my boss. But because it's such a car-oriented culture, that everything is, obviously the electric car is better than a gasoline car if it's not a big giant pickup truck. But to reduce the embodied carbon, what I did was I got myself an electric bike. And the electric bike has a very low embodied carbon because it doesn't weigh very much. And the batteries are not very big. It's that little thing in the rear. And I use it all year. I mean, I look like an idiot, but I dressed like this in the middle of the city with my old ski gloves. But basically, in the coldest weather, you go out. It's the old line. There's no such thing as bad weather, only inappropriate clothing. And so you dress properly, you go out. Everybody knows that. I mean, Harriet was showing me, I was looking on their website, everybody out there here out walking and hiking in the middle of winter. You do that, you know how to dress. The thing is that the city has to make it possible. The city has to be designed to accommodate it. Like, for instance, here in Berlin, which I loved, there's a place to walk, there's a place to ride, there's a place to sit while you wait for the streetcar, and then, way over on the left, there's a lane for cars. Toronto almost looked like that during the first year of the pandemic when they built these lines. And the thing is about electric cars, electric bikes, is that where they're going to make the biggest change are in suburbs and in rural communities. This was a study that looked in the UK at how much impact would an electric bike make. And the further, in the city where I'm in Toronto, I have a choice. I can walk up to the corner, I can get a streetcar, or I can get in a bike. But for people who live too far from anything to do that, you can't. The electric bike, I think, is going to be in a revolution that way. So in the hierarchy of where we have to go, walking is best, cycling is next, e-bikes next, public transport next, club car sharing, then the private car. So that's the problem we face, particularly in Canada, because we're so fixated on the car. And you can't get in a plane. When our company was bought, I had to go meet the new boss, fly to New York, and again, a 30-hour trip to New York took up a month's worth of carbon. So what do? Get out of your car. It's the single biggest factor in most people's footprints. I didn't say get rid of it. We still have one for the occasional trip, but use it as little as possible. Choose where you live carefully. It's the biggest influence on how much you drive. Where you live defines how you get around. Fly as little as possible. Now, here's one that surprised me. When they did the original study, they didn't even make a big deal about what we buy, our consumption. But it isn't true. I mean, I happen to have a fetish for owning everything that Apple ever made. And you can sort of see it all set up on the table here. I figure I work all day on my computer. It's important to me. I should have the best. So I've got the MacBook Pro. I've got the iPad Pro. I got the AirPods. I've got the watch. I've got everything. And you start adding up the carbon footprint of those and dividing it by the number of years that you've got the equipment to get its sort of lifestyle carbon. And it's 80 for my iPhone. It's like 824 kilograms for my iMac. It's like it's 174 for my. It's as heavy as my house in carbon. It's ridiculous. Even my dinky little watch here is 38 kilograms of carbon emitted in making it. And when I totaled it up, it came out to 400 kilograms a year, 1.191 tons of carbon in total, 400 kilograms a year, 16% of my total carbon budget, bigger than my furnace, heating my house. The other thing that I didn't account for at all is clothing. Being a male architect who wears the same black outfits all the time, I didn't think clothing was going to be a big deal at all. But in fact, when this study, the C40 study was done, they found that clothing, because people don't fly all that much and they're not as crazy about electronics as I am, clothing was like just after private driving, ahead of electronics and appliances and aviation, that it was a big, big part of the carbon budget. And I don't know if anyone heard me talking about this on Ontario Morning, yesterday morning. I was interviewed about sort of the issues of sustainability in clothing. There's an English group that picked up on the that study that I mentioned about the clothing, and they really simplified it to a very simple list of things. Keep things longer and clutter. Try to have your holidays local and minimize your flights. Eat more of a plant-based diet. Dress retro. Buy less clothing and buy old clothing. Travel fresh. And then do something out in the street to change the system. Finally, the last thing, of course, is what we buy. So much of it is disposable. We have this great system, or had this great system, of the brewer's retail, where we totally understand the concept of taking a bottle back. That's what they call circularity. It ridiculously lowers the carbon footprint of packaging when you take it back like this. When we take those bottles back, they get refilled 34 times, and it has an incredibly low footprint. And, again, I'm sorry, I go on about Doug Ford, but he's trying to wreck the beer store system. When they bring it into corner stores, then it's all going to be cans. And cans have to be melted down, and they have a much higher carbon footprint than bottles. Not to mention they're lined with bisphenol A, which is a endocrine disruptor, and I don't think anyone should be drinking beer out of cans, but it's almost impossible to find bottles anymore and it's a real problem. And everything used to come this way. We used to get our milk that way. Coke was that. It was all local businesses because it was heavy to take bottles back and forth, and it didn't travel very far. So you made the Coke and beer in your community. Just O'Keefe, that doesn't exist anymore, had 5 different breweries serving Ontario so that they didn't have to carry the bottles back so far. 5. Now there's 1 for the mega corporation that makes all the beer. And it's all this guy's fault, Bill Coors. He invented this 2-part beer can in the mid-50s and didn't patent it. He gave the rights away to everybody in the beer business that wanted to do it. And they just basically built monster breweries because they could use those wonderful new highways to ship beer all around the country and basically put all of the little craft brewers small local brewers out of business. And centralized production happened with food too. The highways changed everything so that, McDonald's now basically could sell food more cheaply because they weren't paying waitresses, they weren't paying for real estate. They offloaded all of that cost to us, with us sitting and eating in our cars or sitting and eating at their picnic table in the nice weather. And we didn't know even. There was no litter before then. People didn't understand about it and would just throw everything on the ground. I remember this from when I was a kid. On my father's boat, you finish the beer bottle, you throw it over the side. This is what people did. And so they've had to educate us. They got Susie Spotless to say, every little bit hurts. And so they were doing all this to train us to pick up their garbage, basically. So it was the single-use system. And when that broke down, when the landfills were getting full, they invented recycling. And recycling was basically, they were afraid that the cities all wanted to get deposits back on everything. And so they invented recycling so that they wouldn't have deposits. They said, we'll redo all this. And they've trained us since we were children that recycling is the most virtuous thing that we can do. And they trained us from the earliest age. My grandkid had one of these. Kid's got one of these. You wouldn't have your kid playing with a garbage truck. They're filthy. But recycling is virtuous and wonderful. And they do studies. And they actually find in study after study that what is the top thing you can do for the local environment? Recycle. What is the behavior that you can do that would have the biggest impact on society, avoiding package recycling? And it was all a lie. It all basically, for the longest time, was shipped to China, which basically had cheap enough labor to separate the plastics. And of the system that was going maybe, what was it? It was 14% actually got picked up. 8% was cascaded recycling, which is what we call downcycling. It goes into lumber and benches and things like that. And 2% was really recycled. And now they're all promising what they're calling chemical recycling, which is they're going to take it all back to its basic chemistry. But it doesn't work. It still has to be picked up. And it's more expensive than the stuff that they actually make straight from the natural gas itself. It doesn't pay. And we're all slobs. Here we are. Who's going to recycle? If here you are in a Tim Hortons parking lot with a garbage can probably in front of every car, and this is how we treat it, it's going to be pretty hard to get a recycling system that works. But it's what we really have to do. What I tried to do in my year is avoid ever buying single-use plastics or drinking out of a can. We have to lose this culture of convenience. We have to sit down and enjoy the coffee. We have to redesign and rethink the whole system to get true circularity like we did at the beer store. We know how it works. So again, from computers to clothing, the question about sufficiency applies. How much do we really need? For any consumer good, the best strategy is to buy high quality with timeless design, maintain it well, and use it as long as possible. And the same applies, it's everything. I won't spend much time on leisure other than to simply note that I used to love more than anything else to get in the car, drive for 2.5 hours to Collingwood, to get electrically winched up a hill, to slide down artificial snow made with pumped water and electricity, and then get in the car and drive back. And clearly I wasn't going to do that. But in my year, what I did was I got cross-country skis and I bungee corded them to my e-bike and I went to High Park. And you know what? I had a good time. I didn't have a big carbon footprint, got a lot of fresh air and exercise, and I did it more often, and you don't pay any lift tickets. So, and it's not like it's a lesser experience. Cross-country skiing is wonderful, and I really got to it, and if I never get my snowboard again, I'll be perfectly happy. I'm old enough I shouldn't get my snowboard again. So, this is what I'm doing in conclusion. I did all of that careful spreadsheeting of everything, and I found that it didn't make all that difference. The simple story is, don't eat red meat, don't drive a gasoline car, don't get in an airplane. But there's a bigger story, which is it's the embodied carbon, the upfront carbon that kills you. It's in many cases far worse than the operating carbon. Like you take your iPhone, it takes nothing to run it, takes nothing to charge it, because that's how it's designed. They want it to last a long time. You don't want to be plugging it in all the time. So they make it incredibly efficient. But the upfront carbon is what kills you with it. And it's the same as homes, with really efficient homes. And how we live and how we get around are not two separate issues. They're the same thing. It's much easier to live a low-carbon lifestyle if you live in a place designed before the car took over. Like, I can do it. If I'd wanted to do my project here, it would have been hopeless. I could not have done it. It's just a fact of life that until our whole world is completely electrified, because remember, carbon is different than energy. That we don't, if you've got like clean nuclear and hydro-powered electricity, and you run everything on electricity, and you can afford it, then run it. You're not putting out any carbon, and that's what we have to worry about, is carbon. And that's why the answer of all of this is the electrification, the use of heat pumps instead of natural gas, the use of electric cars, or I think better, electric bikes instead of gasoline cars. We can live a nice, comfortable, sufficient lifestyle without putting out a lot of carbon if we make the right choices. And you don't need a radical change in diet. We don't have to go all vegan. Just eat less red meat, eat more local, and shorten the cold chain. I love this picture of how, it's Stockholm in 1928, and I think it could be Toronto in 2028 if they wanted it to be. And it's not going to be North Bay, but you can see that it is a viable lifestyle. It was then and it is today. There's this chart also that came out in the IPCC report that points out, it's not in my book, but I'll put it somewhere where you can get it because it came out after, that if you go down the y-axis, you go down the left side, and all of the things that we do to reduce our carbon footprint, compact cities, non-motorized transport, et cetera, and then you go across the top at all the benefits from it. You get better quality food, you get improved health, you get improved sanitation. All of these things across the top that are the blue squares are improved by living a low-carbon lifestyle. So it's not just, it's like this joke cartoon from 2009 that, you solve this carbon crisis, you solve the climate crisis, and all these other benefits all come along. So I'll end with my favorite slide from that English group that I showed the stuff previously, that, it's really because of the issue of the embodied carbon of making everything, the real key line that I'll end with is less stuff, more joy. Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing. So do we have any questions? Perfect.
Yes, I have a question. Do I have to go down the mic?
No.
Come on, Harriet. No, come on. I'll race you to the mic.
No, you can stay where you are.
I wanted to mention one thing, that I really hadn't planned to drive all the way from Toronto to do this, because that's 16 days of my carbon budget. It's a ridiculous amount, because I have this place in Dorset. And I thought, we'll be up there for the weekend. And then, it's just a nice drive from Dorset to here. That would be great. And then my wife tells me, Lloyd, I'm still taking piano Monday afternoons. We're not doing that. And then I said, okay, I'll go there and stay after. And then my publisher of my book called me yesterday and said, hey, Lloyd, I'm in Toronto for some book awards. Can we have lunch on Wednesday? So basically, my plan had been, I would have done this virtually. I felt once all this happened, I couldn't change at the last minute, especially since you bought all these copies of my book. So I'm here, but I'm apologizing for my 16 days worth of carbon getting here.
Lloyd, it's so enjoyable. It's the second time I've heard your slideshow, and I enjoyed it just as much the second time. How can we, the ordinary Joe Blow, find out what the embedded or upfront carbon count is for stuff that we buy? Because most, other than Apple, it's not easily found, is it?
It's not. It's really, really hard. And it really varies on so many things. Like, again, I could give you, if someone figured out the carbon footprint of something in Toronto, what is it going to be up here in North Bay when it's spending all this time in the truck getting here? I mean, I'd love to know what the footprint of ordering from Amazon is, you know, when they're in relatively small trucks and coming all of this distance. So it varies on location. It varies all over the place. So but it is changing. Like Apple was a company that was doing it. Unilever, the big food company, is next year going to be putting carbon labels on all of their food. In the European Union, it's becoming a legal requirement to put it on. It's legislation, so by 2025, there will be a carbon footprint at the factory, not at your place. They can only do that. But when it leaves their factory, here's the carbon footprint. And then there will be easy calculators for what it does to get to you. But right now, it's almost impossible. I would say that with the exception of the Apple equipment, that everything that I had in my spreadsheet was an educated guess.
Oh. Thank you.
Lloyd, I wanted to ask you if you could recommend a website where you can do a simplified carbon footprint. For example, Climate Heroes has one where you can at least get a start.
There are quite a few of those out now. There's a group called the Carbonauts that the founder of the website I write for set up. I think the better thing for me to do would be to send you an email. I don't know if there's somewhere everybody follows. We developed a much more sophisticated version of mine with that Hot and Cool Institute that's at a website, one spelled out 5.org. But it's a piece of work to try and do. You know, you've got to evaluate everything you bought in the last 2 years before you can even start, just so you know that embodied carbon of everything that you've got already. There are simple ones. I think you just mentioned one, but I'll send some links.